I'm Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor at King's College London School of Security and Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. When we look at the Abrams Accord between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, we're looking at a formalized relationship that goes way back than the actual agreement in 2020. It's a relationship that has been forged over more than a decade, over common ideological synergies as well as common geostrategic interests. So that relationship goes back in the field of military cooperation, intelligence sharing and cooperation, as well as in the field of information technology and sharing know-how in the field of information and cyber operations. Now, with the Abrams Accords, all these relationships that already existed for quite a long period of time have now been formalized and have provided a more open and overt character to this relationship, allowing the UAE and Israel to kind of sign agreements and contracts more in the open between companies, but thereby just creating a more overt appearance of what is already or has already been for a very long time an agreement between the two countries that works very well. It's based on ideological synergies. It's about both Israel and the United Arab Emirates fear political Islam. Both of them fear the Arab street and the Arab public sphere. Both of them were very critical of the Arab Spring and of the changes that the Arab Spring could bring to what they both considered to be a region that was dominated by and controlled by authoritarian stability. Apart from that, there are common geostrategic interests as well between the two countries, and obviously geostrategic interests when it comes to containing political Islam, when it is about containing terrorism, what they call, as well as containing obviously Iran. And in these fields, over the last decades, the two countries have already cooperated. What we see now coming out of the Abrams Accords is a more intensification of military and intelligence cooperation. We see that, in terms of military intelligence, the UAE and Israel have engaged in Yemen. They have engaged together in Sudan. Obviously, the UAE are offering the Israelis a new hub for intelligence in the Arabian Gulf to directly focus on Iran. And obviously that has been that's something that the Israelis have used. And if you see if you look at the high caliber individuals who've come to the UAE from Israel, they were all from the intelligence community, from the military community, and most of it is directly directed towards dealing with Iran and the threat of Iran. Beyond that, obviously, if you look at information and cyber technology, what we see there is that Israeli experts, military intelligence experts and cyber experts have already worked in the UAE for many, many years, way before the signing of the Abraham Accords. And these are people who bring critical know-how and critical capacity and capability to the UAE. And obviously that was only allowed to happen with the consent of the Israeli government. And that kind of shows us that the relationship between the UAE and Israel very much predates the 2020 agreement or Abraham Accord. And so in that field, we'll see that these agreements in information technology, knowledge sharing and know-how sharing, this will continue. Apart from that, what we see is that in the field of business, there have been a lot of new agreements that have been signed, obviously the field of tourism, but also in the field of health science and obviously cyber, AI and biotechnology. So in all these areas, Israel is a leading country, and the UAE, as the arguably most powerful Arab state today, is looking for ways to even expand its reach and strategic depth across a field and a range of different portfolios and domains, and Israel can very much help with that. And this is what the Abraham Accords can deliver to both the UAE and Israel, because obviously Israel gains access to a region that they were never allowed to be formally represented in. And that is obviously a win-win situation for both. At the moment, the question has become to what extent Saudi Arabia might join the Abraham Accords. And obviously there have been several occasions where the US administration, especially Trump administration, has reached out to the Saudis in trying to make them endorse a formal agreement with Israel. So far, this has not happened. We've seen Benjamin Netanyahu even flying directly to Saudi Arabia, holding meetings with Mohammed bin Salman. There have been meetings between heads of intelligence, Saudi intelligence, as well as Israeli intelligence. Again, like with the UAE, it's built around a common threat perception about Iran. And it goes, obviously, it also kind of plugs into the vision that Mohammed bin Salman has for his country, which is a vision of building a more sophisticated AI-based economy of the 21st century. Again, Israeli technology and know-how would be able to help with that. So there is something in it for Saudi Arabia in the long term. However, there is something that holds them back, and that's something that these are obstacles that for the time being will not be easily overcome. So the most important obstacle obviously is the Palestinian cause and Israel's blatant disregard for the interest of the Palestinian people, and Palestine, a disregard for the two-state solution and the Arab peace initiative in the Middle East, means that Saudi Arabia, as the sponsor of the Arab peace initiative, as well as somewhat the self-proclaimed leader of the Islamic world and Arab world as well, cannot afford signing an agreement with Israel if Israel continuously disregards all the agreements that were made in the past. So if we, especially under the government of Bibi Netanyahu, we've seen the Israelis really breaching a lot of international law when it comes to expanding territory, when it's about seizing territory and making it under, bringing it in under Israeli jurisdiction, as well as obviously expanding settlements. All these things are highly problematic for the Arab public sphere, for the Arab public. It's also problematic for the Saudi street. So a lot of people in Saudi Arabia are still, especially the older generation, still think, despite, all the rumors that Saudis have now been entirely disenfranchised with the Palestinian cause, despite that, in the older generation, still a lot of Saudis don't feel that this would be the right move. Kind of building a relationship with the Jewish state is not something that should be within the interest of Saudi Arabia. However, there are changes, especially among the Arab youth, those people, the Saudi Arabian youth that support Mohammed bin Salman. There are more and more voices saying, why should we care about the Palestinians? They never cared for us. And in many ways there is a rethink happening, but that is a gradual process that I think will take time. And unlike the United Arab Emirates, where freedom of thought is entirely controlled, and obviously freedom of speech is entirely controlled, Saudi Arabia still has some sort of remnant of a public sphere. They haven't lived under the same sort of repressive regime for as long as the Emiratis have. So despite the fact that under Mohammed bin Salman a lot of things have changed, there is still a significant pool of mobilization within Saudi Arabia that would be critical of any normalization with Israel. And that is kind of the key obstacle for Saudi Arabia at this point to formalize the relationship. But that is not to say that Saudi Arabia cannot do what the UAE have done for the past decade, basically building relationships under the table and creating synergies that might not be directly overt. Now, the Abraham Accords obviously were a means of the Trump administration to score foreign and security policy victories. There was obviously, especially if you look at the role of Jared Kushner as a special advisor and envoy to the Middle East, and obviously son-in-law of Donald Trump, it was his personal vision for how to create a better Middle East, which is most of the time, for the most part, better for Israel, not really necessarily better for the Arab world. Entirely disregarded the Palestinian cause, obviously, but it was something that was supposed to bring about some sort of victory that benefited Israel as well as benefited the Trump administration at home, especially in evangelical circles. Now, that is obviously why the US government at the time, under Donald Trump, was really behind the Abraham Accords. With Biden coming in, first of all, the new Biden administration doesn't focus as much on the Middle East as the Trump administration did. I think for Joe Biden, East Asia, the Pacific is a lot more important than the Middle East. And we see that in terms of prioritization, even if you look at the new US Secretary of State and his first calls and attempts to reach out to partners, the Middle East didn't feature as prominently as it did under Donald Trump. So that being said, Israel will not feature as prominently in US foreign and security policy as it did under the Trump administration. And obviously, I think most people in the State Department see overall the Abraham Accords as a positive development. It's a development that brings together partners of the United States in the region, which is positive. It potentially provides a new front against common threats in the region. Where they are differing, though, where Biden differs with Trump, is obviously in the perception of Iran as the menace of the region. Here, Joe Biden 180 degrees, disagrees fundamentally with the Trump administration. He sees obviously the nuclear problem of Iran as something that needs to be targeted, but he will try to find ways, more diplomatic means as well, using diplomatic means to actually forge a new agreement, a new JCPOA, a new Iran deal. And the hawkish approach that both the UAE and Israel have taken towards Iran, and much of their activities in terms of cooperating in fields of military intelligence against Iran are not necessarily things that the US administration under Joe Biden will support. And the same goes for Yemen. I think the Biden administration will take an entirely different view on the Yemen war, and will not unilaterally only focus on Iran's role in it through the sponsoring of Houthis, but will also look at the Emirati and Saudi role in it, and will try to find a more comprehensive, more inclusive solution to the conflict. And here again, Israel's synergies with the UAE on fighting and being so predominantly focused on Iran is definitely something that Joe Biden and his administration will not support. So they will not necessarily build on it, but will probably welcome it as overall a positive development for stability in the region.